Good afternoon. We are going today to the program of 3 ECFA recipients, the Early Career Faculty Award recipients that we awarded in April 2024. We've awarded them a plaque already at our annual dinner, but we wanted to give them the opportunity in a short talk. So we have 3 short talks to talk about how the award given to them has facilitated their research, their program, their package. And the first one that we'll see is Julia Crowley, who is assistant professor in urban planning and design, who works with FEMA issues, and that's certainly high on the list of attention. And she went to a FEMA emergency management, higher education symposium, whatever that conglomeration means. And I'm looking forward to hear about that.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Waterberg, and thank you everyone for having me today. So I'm going to give a little overview on the outcomes of both the lecture I gave and the networking opportunities that I had while attending the FEMA Higher Education Symposium. So on my brief presentation agenda, I'm going to start by providing you with an overview of the FEMA Higher Education Symposium, what the purpose of it is, what we do there. Then I'll talk a little bit about the presentation that I gave. Then I'll go into the networking opportunities that I had. And one of those opportunities had to do with finding out about an external grant program that I did not know about before I attended the symposium. And I then applied for the grant, and I was really fortunate to receive the grant. So I will wrap up my presentation by talking a little bit about the current research that I am conducting with that grant. Okay, so to start, a little bit on the FEMA Higher Education Symposium. So this is typically held annually in early June, and it's located on the Emergency Management Institute campus, or EMI for short, which is in Emmitsburg, Maryland. Roughly about an hour-and-a-half drive from Washington, D.C. So who in here has heard of FEMA before? Raise your hand. They're all over the news these days, of course. Again, it stands for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and this is the agency that deals with disaster management at the federal level in the United States. So the EMI, or the Emergency Management Institute, is actually owned by FEMA. It was formerly a Catholic convent, and then the federal government bought it from them, and they turned it into this training center where they have classrooms, they have dormitories where trainees and other participants stay, a dining hall, a gym, everything. So typically their trainings are for emergency management professionals at all levels of government. They usually last about 4 days. But the Higher Education Symposium is another event that they have on their campus. So just like with the trainees, participants will stay in the dormitories. Some, like myself, will present. You attend lectures in the different buildings and dining hall and everything. And the main purpose of this symposium is to bring together academics who do research in the field of emergency management and practitioners to really better understand how academic research can benefit the field. So in the United States, we do have some degree programs that are specifically for emergency management, but there's also affiliated fields like geography, public administration, urban planning. Like myself, I work a lot on the preparedness side of disasters, writing plans to hopefully make the outcomes in response and recovery go a little bit more smoothly. And then another benefit to this symposium is just for academic educators to get up to date in the field. So they have like the textbook publishers there to make sure that classes, like I teach a class on natural hazards and disaster planning, just to make sure that all the information is up to date because this field is always changing as we get more disasters and learn new things from those events. So now I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about my presentation. So I had submitted an abstract to present at this conference, and my presentation was all about integrating academic research with local community resilience training. So when I say resilience in this context, I'm talking about communities being able to bounce back after difficult events like disasters. So in my presentation, I talked about two different experiences that I've had so far in my career. One with my research when I was doing my dissertation. I looked at disaster debris management, so planning in advance for the cleanup of a disaster and what should go into a plan. What are best practice scenarios? And I was able to use those findings to create a training course for FEMA on how to plan for debris management. So I talked a little bit about that, and then I also talked about integrating academic teaching with local community resilience training. And I talked about a case study from about 2 years ago when I first came to UMKC. My environmental planning class, we worked on developing and delivering a local resilience training for the South Round Top neighborhood. And I worked with my colleague, Dr. Jacob Wagner. We also worked with his studio class. So the main purpose of the presentation was for both academic and practitioner audiences in emergency management to really look at ways that we could take our academic research and also our pedagogy to bring that into local community resilience training. So that was the presentation part, but networking was also a really, really important element of attending this symposium for me. So I talked about earlier how the EMI campus has buildings for classrooms, dormitories, dining halls, but they also have this building here. And the name of it is the Command Post, aka the Campus Pub. So this is the place where people, of course, at least 21 years of age and older can go at the end of the day after attending the lectures to have a drink, relax, and network with other professionals in the field. So when I traveled to the symposium back in June, I actually came there directly from the state of Maine, where I was conducting field work for another study that I was doing on the debris management process for a record-setting flood that Maine had back in December of 2023. So I was interviewing emergency management personnel who worked on the debris management, and one common theme was all about the resource constraints that they had to planning, lack of funding, lack of emergency management personnel, and how that really took away their opportunities to plan in advance. So by the time that I got down to this symposium, that was all on my mind, what I learned at that through my research. And so one night I was at the pub and I came across a group of veteran emergency managers, and I ended up having great conversations with them about these resource constraints, and they were from different states, so I got to get their opinions and their perspectives, and it really made me feel like, hey, I'd love to do a nationwide study where I could better survey these constraints and try to quantify them and really make the argument to FEMA for more funding for pre-disaster planning. So the next day I was having lunch with another academic participating in the conference when I learned about the FEMA higher education program. This particular academic had received the award the year before. And then I went to a presentation later that day to get more information on the program. I had never heard of this before. And the main purpose is to support initiatives that bridge the gap between research and practice in the field of emergency management. So it's a pretty broad scope. It funds a lot of different types of research, but the main requirement is that it has to be related to emergency management, and you have to somehow show that it's practical to practitioner work through your research. So I got this idea, I think I want to apply for that and do some sort of a nationwide study on these resource constraints. So when I got back from the conference, I worked on my application, submitted it in late June. was really, really excited to find out, probably at about late August, that I was a recipient of the grant. So I recruited a co-PI. He is a statistician in the computer science department here at UMKC, so he could help me with all the numbers and the data analysis. And so we put together a survey that focuses on the planning needs, one for debris management, so the cleanup process, like what I talked about earlier, and the other one for hazard mitigation plans. So when I say hazard mitigation, I'm talking about taking steps in advance to try to prevent disasters altogether, or to try to prevent the magnitude of the aftermath. Now, in the United States, we used to have a federal incentive program for creating debris management plans in advance, but that was stopped a few years ago. We currently have a federal incentive program for creating hazard mitigation plans in advance. So that's why I wanted to include both of those plans, because I think they're really, really important, but one has an incentive program, the other one does not. So in my survey, I'm looking at, do local governments have either of these plans? If they have them, how well were they implemented in the aftermath of a disaster? And if they don't, what are some of the resource constraints that are causing that? What could help them to develop these plans? And not only develop them, but also have training to talk about how they're going to implement them in the event of a disaster. So one of the main things that I'm doing with the funds involves traveling to different state emergency management conferences. So in every state in the US, there's a state level emergency management agency, and usually they'll bring together all the local emergency managers in this state conference once a year, and the conferences are all at different times. So I've been traveling to 4 different states in different parts of the country, different types of hazards that they are prone to, and different FEMA regions. FEMA actually divides the United States into 10 different regions. So here in Kansas City, we're part of Region 7, which happens to be headquartered here. And we have the states of Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska. So my first conference was back in September in Manhattan, Kansas. That was the state emergency management conference for Kansas. Last month, I went to Boise, Idaho to attend their conference. And at these conferences, I'm networking. I'm also deploying my survey, because I found in the past that when I've done survey research, when I just send an email out and nobody knows me, a lot of times I wonder if I'm legitimate, if I'm scamming them or what. So I think actually going to the conferences, introducing myself, networking, letting them know what I'm doing, why I'm doing this research, has been extremely helpful in getting respondents and getting people to fill out the survey. And not only that, but learning more about the particular needs of that part of the United States. In April, I will be going to Jekyll Island, Georgia, to attend the Georgia State Emergency Management Conference. And then in May, I will be going to Fort Worth, Texas, to attend their conference. And I've also been doing some networking with FEMA to get my survey deployed to different parts of the country. One example, the person who heads the FEMA Higher Education Research Award does a quarterly newsletter. So this month, she's going to be sending out information on the study and the survey link, so more emergency managers can fill it out. And my co-PI and I, our goal is to get the research done this coming summer. In August, we have to submit a report to FEMA about the outcomes of our research. And we also plan to submit a manuscript for peer review after we have all the data and analyze it. And again, our main goal is to just quantify the numbers at the national level to FEMA, so we can really make the argument for more funding for local emergency management planning resources. But had I not gone to this symposium, I would not have known about this grant award. And I also would not have had the opportunity to network with the local emergency managers that I did back at the command post, and really develop this idea and really process everything I had experienced in Maine right before the symposium when I was doing the other research. So I'm just really grateful for this opportunity, and I look forward to just sharing the outcomes of the research and hopefully a manuscript at some point with everyone. So thank you so much.
Hey, a couple of minutes. Yep,
Oh,
we
question.
have a couple of minutes for questions. Who can I, that,
So what are the oddest things that end up as debris? Just, I mean, things that you
Oh,
find curious.
that's such a good question. I think one thing, they call it household hazardous waste, and that just refers to stuff that all of us probably have in the cabinet underneath our sinks, like everyday cleaning materials. When those commingle with other materials like fallen building debris, that becomes hazardous and it requires special handling, and it can take other types of debris that might otherwise be recyclable and make it non-recyclable. So that would be up in my list. Another one, people have a tendency sometimes to, when debris management is going on, to see that as an opportunity to just dump stuff on the street. So when I was doing my dissertation research, one complaint that I got from an emergency manager in the town of Shawnee, Oklahoma, was that a trailer was just dumped in the middle of the street by someone who said, "Oh, good, I've been wanting to get rid of this for a long time. They're coming around picking up debris. Here's my opportunity." So that's one. I think another one, excess donations. Like when people hear about a disaster on the news, especially in our day and age of 24/7 news coverage, well-meaning people will send something that might not be appropriate to the site. Like this is actually really common, like in parts of the world where they don't have winter. Sometimes people will send winter coats, high heel shoes. And the problem with that is like they don't have the staff to sort that. So they can't get it to people who need it. And in my example, it's kind of questionable if anybody might need that. But then it's creating more waste to manage. So let's say you already have fallen trees, which is a common component of debris management, or fallen buildings, and then you also have these excess donations to manage. So those are just a few examples, but debris management can take on many, many different forms. White goods, washers and dryers that no longer work and need to be disposed of. So the list goes on.
funny,
I'm I'm curious in Region 7,
Yeah.
what the 4 states that are part of it, what their main emergency disaster. You said they kind of focus on what their
Yeah.
main opportunity for disaster.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would say in this region, probably some of our most prevalent hazards, one would be flooding. And the Midwest floods of 1993 actually resulted in a lot of reform for hazard mitigation programs for FEMA in general. But yeah, flooding is a big one. Winter storms, as we know from recently, is another one. Tornadoes and extreme heat. So those are some of our most common hazards for our region. But one other thing I want to note about the FEMA regions is sometimes when a particular region gets overwhelmed, like the region where Florida is located in, they'll actually send FEMA personnel from other regions to help out if the situation calls for it. So sometimes, even though like in Region 7, we focus on our particular hazards, that doesn't mean that our FEMA employees don't get deployed to other parts of the country, like Florida for hurricanes as well.
the nice sunny beaches of Southern California. Yeah, and
I'm not sure this is related to your research, but in reading about the California wildfires, the recent ones in the LA area,
Yeah.
I was really boggled by the spokespersons who said one of the problems is there's so much plastics in these houses. These things are like tinder. So it's not just Santa Ana and it's not the winds.
Mhm.
We are creating fireboxes. And I don't know if the study of debris, I don't know how that fits in, how we can prevent some of making maybe structures safer and less vulnerable.
Yes, and that's such a good question. And that's what gets into the topic of mitigation. Like when I was talking about the hazard mitigation plans, and it's all about taking those steps in advance and something called building codes, which sets standards for how the particular materials for how a building needs to be constructed in a given area due to the hazards that they're prone to. But where that gets a little complicated is that it usually just applies like to newer construction. So when you have something that was built maybe a long time ago before the awareness, it definitely creates more challenges like the example that you gave.
Well, I hope somebody's studying it, figuring out for new construction, how to possibly not use some of these materials, but thank you.